Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, we are gathered here today to commemorate the wonderful, entertaining, amusing season that was Florida State Seminoles in 2024. This has been years, I would say over a decade in the making. I want to take you guys back to 2013. Florida coming off an 11-2 season, beating four teams that finished in the top 10 in the 2012 college football season, Florida State being one of them. And the very next year, the Florida State Seminoles go 13-0, winning a national championship. The Florida Gators go 4-8, losing to a FCS school named Georgia, at the time, FCS school, by the name of the Georgia Southern Eagles, I believe. Or I think they're called the Eagles. Maybe they're called the Golden Eagles. But Georgia Southern, losing to them at home as an FCS squad. And for years, every April 8th, Florida State fans would remind UF fans of the term 4-8ers that they came up with. 4-8 Gators, the 4-8 Gators. The 4-8ers for years. And they rubbed it in our face every opportunity that they could. And even in the down stretch that Florida State program has suffered starting in the late 2010s, they still called us that every chance they had. When they went 5-7 in 2018 under Willie Taggart, they said, well, at least we didn't go 4-8 like Florida did. At least we didn't lose to a FCS school like Florida did. That was their response to going 5-7 and missing a bowl game for the first time in almost 40 years in 2018. Then the next year, they lose to a Boise State team in the Boise State Group of 5 team, the very first game of the 2019 season. And they said, well, it was a Group of 5, but it wasn't FCS like Florida. Later on in that season, they fired Willie Taggart, and they would go on to hire Mike Norvell in the offseason afterwards. Mike Norvell, along with a lot of first-year head coaches in 2020, got a bad break because of the COVID pandemic and how everything in life and in college football in particular was thrown off course because of that. That year was probably looked as if one of the worst seasons in Florida State history. They went 3-6. They got dominated in a bunch of games, lost a lot of football games, lost to Georgia Tech, who was not a good team that year. They were 3-6 and could have been 3-8. But the problem is they had so many COVID outbreaks in their locker room that they had to cancel the games against Wake Forest and Clemson that year. Otherwise, Florida State would have been 3-8 instead of 4-8. So even though they were 3-6, they still had the chance to call the Gators 4-8 every opportunity. Then 2021 happens. They lose. I think they lost to Notre Dame in heartbreaking fashion on Sunday Night Football when it looked like they were about to stage a massive comeback, but their kicker missed a field goal towards the end, and then they would end up losing the game in overtime. But it looked like a good showing at first, right? It looked like there had been some improvements made from the previous season. And the very next week, they lost to an FCS school like Jacksonville State. 13-7, Jacksonville State needed a touchdown, not a field goal, but a touchdown to win the game. Field goal would have done them no good. They still would have lost by 1 point. And on a Hail Mary, instead of doing your typical Hail Mary prevent coverage defense, Mike Norvell allows his defensive coordinator to call a simple two-deep safety look, in which the wide receivers, of course, got behind the safeties. And because they did not have enough men back there to tackle the wide receivers, and one receiver got a great block from his teammate, he was able to run into the end zone. So there you go. Florida State lost to an FCS school. The whole Georgia Southern mocking that Florida State fans had given us for all those, for the previous, 7, 8 years? It was finally out the window. It was over. You can no longer say, well, at least we didn't lose to an FCS school, because you did. And even though some Florida State fans still to this day say, well, your loss is still worse because Georgia Southern just mainly ran the ball. At least Jacksonville State threw the football to beat us. Both teams are still in that boat for losing to an FCS opponent. No matter how you slice it, they're still on the hook for that. And then Florida State would continue to lose a couple more games, 0-4. It looked like they were going to have possibly the worst season. What Florida State had in 2024 at first looked like it was going to be that way for Florida State in 2021 when they started off 0-4. But something happened. They changed, and they made some improvements, and they actually finished the year on a decent stretch. They started off 0-4, but they ended the year 5-7, winning 5 of their last 8. They still missed a bowl game because they lost to the Florida Gators on the final Saturday of the 2021 season, a week after Florida just fired Dan Mullen to be their head coach. Florida, who would go on to hire Billy Napier. And then they lost to Florida on that final season to go 5-7 again and miss another bowl game. This is the from 2017 to 1980, all the way back to 1981. Florida State had not missed a single bowl game. At that point, they've missed 3 of their last 4 after the 2021 season. But Mark Neville hit it big in the transfer portal, getting key contributions from the portal, such as, Trey Benson and Jaheim Bell and Micah Pittman, and they landed some other big names in the portal the very next year, Keon Coleman and Jared Verse. And over the next 2 years, Florida State went from a team that was 8-13 in Mike Novell's first 21 games at Florida State to a team that went 23-1 over a 24-game stretch. 8-13 in 21 games to 23-1 in over the next 24 games afterwards. So it looked like Florida State had reclaimed the supremacy of the state of Florida. Jordan Travis looked like a Heisman Trophy contender at one point. They had great players on both sides of the ball. But then disaster struck. Trying to gear themselves up for a potential playoff run, it's now week 12. Florida State at this point is 10-0. They're hosting North Alabama. I don't know what the name of North Alabama's football team is, so I'm just going to say North Alabama. They're facing North Alabama. They start trailing North Alabama 14-0. 14-0 against a team that was undefeated and trying to qualify itself as a potential playoff program for the 2023 season. Down by 14 points to North Alabama, Jordan Travis trying to fire up an adrenaline into his football team on a pass play, scrambles, go passes the line of scrimmage, gets a big run, but in the process of getting that big run for a first down, he ends up breaking his leg. Now, for Florida and Florida State rivalry among the fans aside, I did not enjoy seeing Jordan Travis's injury. I remember the night that he broke his leg. I saw it live because I couldn't believe that Florida State was trailing North Alabama to 14-0 at one point. I had to go switch to that game just to make sure that I wasn't tripping. I mean, I was watching Florida versus Missouri at the time of that event, and I had to switch the channels real quick before going back to the Florida and Missouri game just to make sure that what I saw was correct. Yeah, Florida State was down 14-0. And because of that, Jordan Travis felt like he had to make a play to put some life into his team, and he ended up breaking his leg. Now, obviously, you don't wish for these things to happen, regardless if you're a fan of a rival program or not. But that injury lit a fire underneath that Florida State team because they would go on and put 50-something points on North Alabama and blew them out for the rest of the way, which they should have played like that beforehand. But anyways, despite losing Jordan Travis, they were able to beat their in-state rival Florida at the Swamp, put Florida at 5-7, giving Billy Napier his second straight losing record, but having to miss a bowl game. And it was the first time the Gators had missed a bowl game since 2017. Florida State finished the regular season undefeated, went on to win the ACC championship the very next week against Louisville, even with backup quarterbacks. Because the backup to Jordan Travis, who was playing in the game for Florida, got a concussion in that game, and he had to miss out. So Florida State had to play their third-string quarterback at the time, Brock Glenn, in order to win the ACC title. Despite their efforts, they did not make the college football playoff, or as they like to call it, the college football invitational. Florida State faithful does. And they went all downhill from there because they were slated to play against Georgia in the Orange Bowl when the college football playoff wasn't on the line. A bunch of dropouts happened. Guys entering the NFL draft or entering the transfer portal, and Florida State with basically less than 2/3 of a football team left got destroyed by Georgia 63-3 in the Orange Bowl. And it was all downhill from there. Because afterwards, they spent the entire Florida State players, administration, institution, and the fan base spent the entire offseason still upset about being left out of the quote-unquote invitational. And, there became contractual disputes with the ACC and with ESPN. So they now went to file paperwork to leave the conference and trying to exit out of their ESPN deal. And, in the process of that, it was like they lost focus on what was important. That was playing football games. They brought in DJ Uiagalelei from the transfer portal, who was a former Oregon State quarterback after being the Clemson Tigers starting quarterback. They bring him in, and they went again, invested heavily into the transfer portal, and things did not go well when the season started. First game of the season, they lose to Georgia Tech. They were ranked number 10 in the nation. They were the first official game of the 2024 season, so all of college football was watching this, and they ended up losing 24-21. But if you watch the game, Georgia Tech beat them a little bit more in a dominating fashion than what the final score indicated. Granted, they still needed a clock expiring field goal in order to win. As embarrassing as that was, it's still one of my favorite Florida State losses I've ever seen in my entire lifetime. But you figured, okay, they lost that one, but it's only it's still, technically it was week 0. It's only the first game of the season. They still have an entire season to go. And then the following week, on Labor Day weekend, on a Monday night, they get blown out by Boston. They get dominated by Boston College. Worse than what Georgia Tech did. 28-13, and the only reason why it wasn't 35-13 because Boston College chose to kneel the ball a few more times to end the game when they were inside Florida State's 5-yard line instead of just tacking on another touchdown. They could have done that if they wanted to, but they chose not to. Which, ironically, their act of sportsmanship was actually a bigger insult than scoring another touchdown, because that was their way of telling Florida State, we're taking it easy on you. You probably know that, and everybody else watching knows that. So now Florida State is at a fork in the road early in the season. Associated Press top 10 in the preseason, down with a 0-2 record to start out of the gate. They're coming on a bye week, and their very next opponent after the bye week was the Memphis Tigers, who Florida State hired Mike Novell from in the first place. After they fired Willie Taggart, they hired Mark Novell from the Memphis Tigers because he had taken the Memphis Tigers to a Cotton Bowl appearance in 2019, the year Taggart was fired. So certainly after 2 weeks away and 2 weeks of preparation, Mike Novell certainly has more talent than Memphis. He should be able to beat his former stopping grounds, right? Nope. 0-3 Florida State will fall to in a game that was uneventful for Florida State on all three phases: offense, defense, special teams. They didn't do anything. They made a lot of mistakes. And it wasn't even like Memphis played an efficient game themselves. But when you have a team like Florida State that made the amount of mistakes they made in that game, they didn't really have to. They lost to Memphis 20-12. So it was like at that point, once you saw that, I was like, oh, they're not making a bowl game now because the hardest part of their schedule hadn't even arrived yet. Now, the very next week, things looked up. They got their first victory against Cal due to some key missed field goals and some key turnovers by the Golden Bears. They got their first win. They're 1-3 now. So maybe this was what they needed. The following week, they're on the road at SMU, and this is a critical point in the season because throughout the offseason, Florida State used Southern Methodist as a scapegoat for why they wanted to leave the ACC, because the ACC expanded to include Stanford, California, and SMU, and Florida State said adding Southern Methodist brought down the value of the ACC. Apparently, SMU didn't forget about that because they went ahead and smoked Florida State 42-16. You sued you sued to get out of the ACC because they brought in SMU, and SMU looked like the better football team than you did. That's a few months later. That, my friends, is called karma. And once SMU put that beat down on Florida State 42-16, you realize there was no hope for this Florida State team. There was no spark, there was no fight, there was no urgency from the coaches to the players to the administration and then eventually to the fan base. This is probably the most apathetic amount of emotions I've ever seen from Florida State fan base in my lifetime. They no longer cared about the season. They knew it was done. They knew they were in for a long season. I mean, if you couldn't beat Georgia, if you couldn't, it's one thing to lose to Georgia Tech, but losing to Boston College and Memphis and losing to SMU, in which you weren't even remotely competitive, you knew it was just only going to get worse and worse and worse as the season went on. The next week they get dominated expectedly by Clemson. 2 weeks later, they lose on the road to Duke they lose to Duke Blue Devils in football for the first time in the history of Florida State. They lost to Duke in football. So at this point they're 1-6 before their annual rivalry game with the Hurricanes came along. And Miami did what they were supposed to do. They saw their biggest rivals bleeding in the ocean, and like sharks, they attacked and ripped apart FSU 36-14. And then FSU would get smoked again by North Carolina Tar Heels. And then they almost committed a repeat of the Orange Bowl on the road at Notre Dame. They lost 52-3. Final bye week of the season comes. They beat Charleston Southern as expectedly, and then they get housed by their other in-state rival, the Florida Gators, 31-11, to finish the year 2-10. The worst season the Florida State Seminoles have had since the early 1970s. We're talking before Bobby Bowden showed up. Here we are in 2025, celebrating their season on February 10th. Currently at this moment, at the time of this recording, it's February 9th, Super Bowl Sunday at 4:40 p.m. that I'm recording this. But I wanted to record this now because I'm going to watch the Super Bowl and I don't want to forget before it's too late. 2-10 after all that belly aching that they did about the college football quote-unquote invitational throughout the offseason. And they, quite frankly, they didn't even show up to the regular season. They said the Georgia game was meaningless because the college football playoff, it wasn't for the college football playoffs. Well, guess what? They showed that the regular season was meaningless too. 2-10. And the bad part is, if you're a Florida State fan, is that Mike Norvell, unless he shows you a massive improvement from last year, granted, not that high of a ceiling, but unless he shows you a massive improvement, you're going to have bad seasons like this for the next several years because he signed a giant extension with Florida State in December of 2023. Boy, FSU fans are regretting that moment right now, aren't they? Even FSU fans said it themselves that if not for that giant contract, he would have gotten fired last season because that was a fireable offense. Even if you had just won the conference a year prior, going 2-10 in that season, that was a fireable offense. Because there was a lot of football teams Florida State should not have lost to. They should not have lost to Boston College. They should not have lost to Memphis. You can make the argument that maybe they shouldn't even have lost to Memphis or Duke. But it's not only did you lose to those two teams, you weren't even competitive. Well, Duke, you were somewhat competitive. You just made too many turnovers. But Southern Methodist, they just housed you. I mean, it's one thing to lose to Florida and Notre Dame and Miami and Clemson, Boston, maybe even Georgia Tech, but Boston College, Memphis, SMU, Duke. Two of those games you weren't even remotely competitive in. It was a lot of fun watching Florida State last season, and tomorrow when the clock strikes midnight and February 9th turns into February 10th, while one NFL city is going to be celebrating their Super Bowl victory, whether it's Kansas City or Philadelphia, the rest of us college football fans, we're going to be celebrating Florida State. This is not just a celebration from us Gator fans, Miami Hurricane fans. Y'all hate Florida State like we do, so you can join in on it. Quite frankly, all of college football fans can join in on the pointing and laughing at Florida State. Y'all called us the Foreignators for over a decade. We're going to call you the FS2-10. Not FSU, FS2-10 until Florida comes up with a season worse than that. And I don't see that happening for a long time. So, toast to Mike Norvell, DJ Uiagalelei, and TJ Pittinger and all the FSU faithful out there. Congratulations on a terrific 2-10 football season. It was certainly one to remember if you hate Florida State like I do.